How many crises can one news cycle hide before people stop seeing the pattern? Deportations into danger, workers dying in industrial accidents, bombs still falling in the Middle East, and whole populations being boxed in behind walls of dirt. The headlines are separate, the policy logic is not. Today's reports look disconnected at first glance, but once you compare them, the same themes keep showing up. Force dressed up as administration, escalation sold as stability, and civilians paying the bill while leaders talk about control. We're going to break down what these articles actually say, where they agree, where they clash, and what gets left out when the mainstream version trims the story down to something more polite. Start with the Human Rights Watch report on deportations to Mexico, because this is one of those stories that gets flattened into a simple immigration enforcement headline when it's actually much uglier. According to HRW, the Trump administration has deported nearly 13,000 Cubans, Venezuelans, and other nationals into Mexico, where many end up in places they don't know, with no support system, limited medical care, and a real risk of cartel violence. That detail matters. This is not just relocation, it is exposure. What makes the report especially revealing is who is being swept up. These are not all recent arrivals. Many of the Cubans interviewed had lived in the United States since the 1980s or 1990s. Some had green cards before losing them. Several were older people in their 60s, 70s, even beyond that, who were suddenly cut loose from the country they built their lives in and sent into a system they barely understand. That's the part the political talking points don't really want to linger on. It is easier to talk about removal than to admit you're dumping elderly people into a dangerous third country, with no clear public agreement, no judge hearing, and no meaningful due process. HRW says none of the people they interview were taken before a judge to contest the deportation to Mexico, even when they said they feared for their safety. And that's not a minor procedural complaint. That is the whole issue. There's also a quiet contradiction inside the policy itself. The US says it's managing immigration. Mexico says it has accepted third country deportations for years. But the report says the actual arrangement between the two governments has not been made public. So the public is asked to accept a system that is both massive and opaque. We're supposed to believe it's orderly because officials say so, even while the people being processed through it land in cities where shelter is scarce and cartel predation is routine. If you're getting value from this breakdown, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. What mainstream coverage often misses here is that this is not just about deterrence, it's about externalizing the consequences of US policy onto someone else's territory. The deportation doesn't end at the border, it just changes who has to absorb the fallout. Now, compare that with the paper mill disaster in Washington state. 9 workers are missing and presumed dead after a chemical tank rupture at a pulp and paper mill, and a second injured person has died. Officials have called it one of the deadliest US workplace accidents in years. This is the kind of story that should dominate far more of the news cycle than it does, because it says something pretty blunt about the country's priorities. We are endlessly told there is no money, no time, no political room for safety, oversight, or prevention. Yet, somehow there is always money for conflict, policing, surveillance, and bailout logic after the fact. The details are grim. The injuries range from minor to critical. Some workers suffered burns and inhalation injuries. A firefighter was injured responding to the site. Crews were restricted to daylight hours because there was still a risk of leaking caustic liquid, and even the possibility of collapse. In other words, the disaster was so severe that the danger did not end when the initial rupture did. And still, the broader public conversation tends to move on quickly, unless the story can be attached to a bigger political fight. Because when a chemical tank implodes and people vanish inside a worksite, that isn't a freak accident in a vacuum. It's part of a wider pattern where industrial risk is normalized, response is reactive, and regular workers are treated as expendable until the cameras arrive. The same society that can monitor every overseas shipment, every border crossing, and every military target somehow struggles to keep a paper mill tank from turning into a mass casualty event. Maybe that's the comparison worth sitting with. State power is never absent, it just shows up in the places it chooses to protect. The largest story running through all of these articles is the Iran war, because it is the engine pulling half the others along with it. On one side, you have reporting that says talks are continuing in Doha, with a framework possibly close. On another, you have US strikes on vessels near Bandar Abbas, more American attacks in Iran, and Trump threatening to keep escalating if he doesn't get the answers he wants. Then you have Iran saying the US is acting in bad faith, because negotiations are happening under bombardment. That contradiction is not a side note, it is the story. Reuters and AP tend to present this as a tense but active diplomatic track, with language about self-defense strikes and a possible deal nearing completion. Dropsites reporting pushes harder on the sequencing, and that matters. The Iranian officials quoted there say Tehran's framework is built around a simple idea. The war has to stop first, the blockade has to end, frozen assets have to be released, and only then can the nuclear issue be resolved in a structured way. That is a very different picture from the one many Western headlines imply. Because if you only read the shorter versions, it sounds like a technical dispute over uranium levels. But the articles together show a much broader demand structure. Shipping rights, compensation for damages, regional ceasefire conditions, asset releases, and a rejection of being forced to negotiate under military pressure. That is not just a nuclear negotiation, it is a sovereignty fight. And then Trump makes it even stranger by piling on more conditions. He wants countries in the negotiations to sign the Abraham Accords. He wants the Strait of Hormuz open on his terms. He says Oman could be blown up if it doesn't behave. That kind of language is so extreme it almost gets absorbed as background noise, which is dangerous, because it reveals the mindset pretty clearly. Diplomacy is acceptable only if it produces submission. The domestic cost of all this is not abstract either. One of the more revealing pieces in today's batch ties the war to Nebraska, where rising fuel and fertilizer prices are hitting workers and farmers directly. Dan Osborne, the union mechanic challenging a billionaire-backed senator, describes having to stop pumping gas at $30 because the money simply wasn't there. Farmers are saying urea prices have jumped so hard, they're already planning around 2027 instead of this season. That's the part missing from the official war rhetoric. Leaders talk about short-term pain, long-term gain. Meanwhile, the people actually paying the short-term pain are the ones buying fuel, hauling grain, and wondering why their cost of living keeps climbing because of decisions they never voted on and cannot influence. Even the Senate angle is telling. Pete Ricketts has voted against war powers resolutions multiple times. That means the constitutional check on war is being treated as optional, while the economic consequences are treated as unavoidable. The public gets the bill, but not the consent. If the Iran story is about pressure dressed up as negotiation, Gaza and Lebanon are about occupation dressed up as ceasefire. Forensic Architecture's analysis says Israel has built more than 25 kilometers of earth berms inside Gaza, largely along and beyond the so-called yellow line. The practical effect is hard to overstate. Gaza is being physically divided, controlled, and squeezed into smaller space, while the language of a ceasefire keeps floating around as if that word automatically means de-escalation. It doesn't. The report says Israel now effectively controls over 60% of Gaza, has fortified 38 military bases east of the line, and has created buffer zones where destruction reaches hundreds of meters beyond the stated boundary. That means the ceasefire has not ended territorial engineering. And this is where the mainstream framing gets especially slippery. The story is often told as though the military line is a temporary security measure, a frozen front, or an unfortunate but necessary detail in a broader peace process. But the satellite evidence suggests something much more durable, the creation of facts on the ground that make return, withdrawal, and normal life increasingly impossible. Then you have the political language on top of it. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says the plan to remove Palestinians from Gaza will be implemented at the right time. That euphemism matters. It's not an offhand comment. It's a hint that the long-term goal never really left the table. Call it voluntary immigration, call it relocation, call it whatever sounds cleanest in English, but the direction is obvious. Meanwhile, Israeli strikes are still killing civilians in Gaza. One report says 7 people, including 3 women and a child, were killed in a strike on a residential building in Gaza City during Eid celebrations. Israel says it targeted senior Hamas figures. Even if that claim were accepted at face value, the strike still violates the ceasefire terms as described in the reporting. The ceasefire is supposed to stop military operations. Instead, it seems to function as a rhetorical shield for selective violence. Lebanon follows the same logic. Israeli strikes killed at least 31 people across the south, including children, with more than 180 strikes reported in a single day. Displacement orders are still being issued, first responders are still being killed, and yet the conflict is often described as contained, which is a strange word for a place where people are being told to leave entire towns or risk being hit. That is why the missing piece in much of the coverage is intent, not just what happened, but what the pattern accomplishes. The pattern is not peace, it is permanent leverage. Look a little farther out and the pattern keeps repeating. The Pentagon reportedly has forces positioned for a possible attack on Cuba, while Rubio calls the island a national security threat. That's a remarkable way to frame a country under pressure from an embargo and humanitarian crisis. It makes coercion sound like defense. In Somalia, reports say a suspected US or UAE airstrike killed a pregnant woman and 3 children. That story barely makes a dent in mainstream coverage, even though it fits the same model we see elsewhere. Distant violence, blurred accountability, civilian loss, and a press cycle that treats it as routine. And then there's the sanctioning of Francesca Albanese, the UN expert on the occupied Palestinian territory. A court had temporarily pushed back against the sanctions, and then the administration moved to restore them. Whatever one thinks of her conclusions, the message is unmistakable. Criticize them more too directly, and the state will try to make that expensive. So across borders, across agencies, and across different labels, the same system keeps appearing. The names change, the technique doesn't. The big takeaway is that today's news is not a collection of unrelated events. First, deportation policy is increasingly being outsourced into danger zones where the US no longer has to see the human cost directly. Second, the domestic machinery of neglect shows up in places like the paper mill disaster where workers are left to absorb the consequences of weak safety systems. Third, the Iran war is still functioning as a pressure campaign, not a clean diplomatic process, and the costs are landing on American households as much as on the battlefield. Fourth, Gaza and Lebanon show how ceasefire can become a branding exercise for continued control, displacement, and territorial consolidation. And finally, the same playbook keeps showing up in Cuba, Somalia, and even legal attacks on critics. Force first, language second, accountability last. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with the part mainstream coverage is still ignoring. I read those because they usually point straight to the next story. And in the next video, we're going to look at how these overlapping wars, sanctions, and border policies are reshaping the map far beyond the places the headlines actually name.